You keep asking, why me? But what if that question itself is the prison? What if every tear you've cried, every moment of silence from heaven was not punishment, but initiation? The world taught you to believe that faith means understanding, that prayer guarantees answers, that pain must have an explanation. But Bonhoeffer discovered something darker and holier behind the bars that confined him. He realized that when God stops explaining, he begins transforming. That the walls which surround you are not meant to suffocate your faith, but to strip it bare until all that remains is trust. The question, why me, fades only when you no longer need it answered, when you begin to see that the silence of God is not absence, but presence in disguise, a presence that dismantles pride, demands surrender, and exposes what you truly worship when life stops making sense. Somewhere deep inside that cold prison cell, Bonhoeffer stopped asking for explanations. The chains that held his body became metaphors for the illusions he once clung to, the illusion that God must justify himself to human pain. Each night, as the walls whispered with echoes of suffering, he realized that the greater agony was not the waiting but the needing to know. Humanity's obsession with why is a refusal to trust the hands that hold the mystery. And yet in that stillness he saw it, the paradox that shattered his theology and remade his soul. Faith does not survive because it understands. It survives because it dares to remain when everything collapses. The same question that once tormented him, why me, became the door through which divine wisdom entered. But you, watching this, might still believe that your pain is meaningless unless it produces an answer. You might think that God's silence means rejection, that unanswered prayers prove your unworthiness. Bonhoeffer would tell you otherwise. He would whisper that the prison cell where you stand, your loss, your confusion, your sleepless nights, is not the end of your story, but the forge of your transformation. The silence is not a punishment. It is the language of a God who no longer needs to convince you he is real, but wants to teach you how to be real before him. Every unanswered question becomes an invitation to die to the illusion of control, to let faith breathe where reason suffocates. And in that dying, something is reborn, a faith that no longer seeks to understand, but to endure. So perhaps the question isn't why me anymore, but what is being born in me through this? Bonhoeffer's answer did not come as a voice from heaven, but as a slow awakening in the darkness of his cell. He found that peace is not found in explanations, but in participation, in sharing the suffering of Christ, who also cried out and heard nothing back. That moment when heaven seems deaf is not the end of faith, it is where faith begins. So, as you keep searching for reasons, remember, Bonhoeffer found revelation where logic dies, purpose where pain blooms, and God, not in the answer, but in the silence that reshapes the soul. There is a silence that doesn't just surround you, it devours you. It crawls beneath your skin, sits between heartbeats and waits. You call it waiting for God, but in truth it is God waiting for you to stop demanding reasons. That silence was Bonhoeffer's first cellmate. It had no face, no voice, no mercy, only presence. He used to believe that God could be heard through clarity, through the light of understanding, through the well-shaped words of theology. But in the cold echo of his prison walls, he learned a different kind of gospel, one that doesn't explain suffering, but sanctifies it. And it broke him open, the way light breaks through a wound. Behind the bars, faith became a soundless war. Every morning Bonhoeffer woke to the same dull grey ceiling and the same question whispering through his mind. What if God never speaks again? Yet even in that doubt, something began to move. It was not an answer, it was awareness. He realized that God does not vanish in silence. He descends into it, that the absence of divine speech is not the absence of God, but his decision to meet us in our emptiness, to dwell in the stillness we fear the most. Silence, Bonhoeffer wrote, is not a void to escape, but a mirror that reflects what you truly believe when your prayers return unanswered. And when that silence deepened, he discovered its cruelty. and its mercy. It stripped him of every illusion he once worshipped, the illusion of certainty, of control, of comfort disguised as faith. In the beginning, he prayed for explanations. Later, he prayed for strength. But in the end, he stopped praying for anything at all. He began to simply be with the silence within it until it became indistinguishable from the breath of God himself. The cell transformed from punishment into revelation. It was no longer the place where he waited for answers. It was the place where he stopped needing them. What Bonhoeffer found behind those walls is what so many of us flee from every day, the stillness that reveals the truth. We fill our lives with noise, with prayers that are really demands, with the desperate hope that faith will fix what we don't understand. But faith, as Bonhoeffer came to know, is not about fixing, it's about breaking the illusion of who we thought God was, breaking the armor we built to protect ourselves from the unknown. And in that breaking, the soul begins to hear, not a voice from above, but a whisper within that says, I am here, even when I say nothing. Every believer faces a moment when faith stops feeling like faith and starts feeling like betrayal. You hold the promises, but they cut your hands. You repeat the prayers, but they turn to dust in your mouth. That was the battlefield inside Bonhoeffer's soul. His theology could no longer protect him. His intellect, once a fortress, became a cage. He began to see that faith was not a contract, but a crucifixion, the slow dying of the self that demands to understand. Each unanswered question, each long night of silence, stripped him of another layer of certainty until there was nothing left to defend. And that's when faith began to live, not as a feeling, but as fire. He wrote that faith is not the possession of the strong, but the confession of the weak who continue to stand even as their knees tremble. That's the secret no sermon dares to tell you, that true belief often looks like collapse. The soul must be emptied to be filled. The light that comforts you in Sunday hymns is not the same light that visits the cell of the condemned. In that dim place, faith does not glow. It flickers, it gasps for air, it bleeds, and yet it refuses to die. Bonhoeffer discovered that the miracle of faith is not its strength, but its stubbornness. It endures not because it is sure, but because it refuses to let go even when surety burns away. There, between the prayers that never reached heaven and the doubts that never left his mind, Bonhoeffer found the hidden anatomy of trust. It is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to stay. Stay in the silence, stay in the darkness, stay when every instinct tells you to run. Because if you can remain in the place where God seems absent, you begin to realize something sacred, that his silence is not against you, but inside you. It's the slow, painful rebuilding of a soul that no longer relies on external proof. It's the divine surgery that cuts deep enough to remove everything false and leaves only what can withstand eternity. Faith, for Bonhoeffer, became the art of dying before dying. The war was not against doubt, but against the need for comfort. And maybe that's the war within you too. You think you've lost faith because you no longer feel it, but maybe that's when it finally becomes real. Faith that depends on emotion is still a shadow. Faith that survives its death is resurrection. Bonhoeffer didn't conquer doubt. He befriended it. He let it tear him open until he could see God not as a theory, but as a pulse beneath his pain. And from that wound, a deeper faith was born. One that no prison, no silence, no death could take away. Pain has a way of holding up a mirror to the soul. It shows you not who you pretend to be, but who you truly are when all disguises fall away. Bonhoeffer learned this as the days in his cell blurred into one another, time dissolving, faith unraveling, silence thickening into something alive. He realized that suffering does not create who you are. It reveals who you have always been beneath the noise. When everything familiar was stripped away, his books, his voice, his pulpit, he met the raw version of himself, the one that could no longer hide behind sermons or intellect. And in that confrontation, he saw what most believers spend their lives avoiding, the self that fears God's silence more than it loves his will. He began to see that pain, though cruel, is the most honest teacher. It exposes what praise conceals. It shows where your trust ends and your control begins. Bonhoeffer once said that grace without cost is a deception, and the same is true of faith without suffering. A faith that has never been tested by silence is a faith that still belongs to comfort. His prison cell became the classroom where this lesson was carved into him. The cold walls did not preach. They simply stood still, reflecting his own heart back at him. And in those reflections, he found his idols: the need to be heard, the need to be right, the need to be safe. Every one of them had to die before he could hear God's whisper again. The mirror of suffering does not flatter, it does not lie, it breaks. It takes the beautiful theology you built and smashes it into the dust of experience. And in that dust, you either curse God or finally see him. Bonhoeffer saw him, not as a rescuer who lifted him out of pain, but as the presence that entered it with him. The God of the unspoken, the God who bled without explaining himself, the God who does not remove the cross but redeems it from within. The more he looked into that mirror, the more he saw that redemption is not something that happens after the pain. It is something that happens through it. And so suffering ceased to be his enemy. It became his altar. Every moment of despair turned into a prayer too deep for words. Every unanswered night became a psalm of surrender. The mirror no longer showed a man undone by pain, but one remade by it. Bonhoeffer's eyes, once filled with questions, began to carry a different kind of light, the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped needing the world to make sense. In that silence, he didn't just survive, he became transparent, and through that transparency, God could finally be seen. Transformation never happens in the light. The light only reveals what has already changed. The real work, the breaking, the reshaping, the undoing, takes place in darkness. Bonhoeffer came to understand this truth not through doctrine, but through experience, through the nights when hope bled out quietly and faith hung by a thread. That darkness was not empty. It was sacred. It was the womb of rebirth disguised as despair. He stopped begging for dawn because he realized that the dark was not delaying the morning. It was becoming it. What he once feared as absence was in truth the nearness of a God too vast to fit into words. The silence had turned from a wound into a doorway. Every prison cell in the world looks the same from the outside, cold, lifeless, abandoned. But inside, where souls wrestle with eternity, walls can glow. The transformation does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, like the slow thaw of winter. Bonhoeffer's faith did not return with answers, but with awareness. The man who once sought God through reason began to feel him through endurance. He understood that faith is not found in the lifting of burdens, but in learning to breathe beneath their weight. The absence of explanation became its own kind of prayer. Each breath became a confession. You are still God, even here. It was in that unrelenting stillness that his soul began to expand. Pain did not shrink him, it deepened him. The darkness, which once seemed like punishment, became a teacher that whispered the language of eternity: patience, surrender, stillness, trust. He no longer needed to ask why me, because the question had melted into something larger. What is God becoming through me? The cell was no longer confinement, but communion. Bonhoeffer learned that faith is not about escaping the dark, but about carrying light within it, even if it never fully burns away the night. And perhaps this is where the miracle hides, not in deliverance, but in discovery. When the soul stops running from pain, it meets the God who lives inside it. Bonhoeffer's transformation did not make the world kinder or the silence quieter, but it made him different, anchored, unshakable, luminous. He had become the message he once preached. The man who entered the prison as a theologian left it as a testimony. The silence that once tormented him had become his symphony, the darkness his sanctuary. It was there, in that unseen space, that trust was no longer something he practiced. It was something he had become. The answer never comes as thunder. It comes as stillness that no longer frightens you. Bonhoeffer's revelation was not a sentence written in light. It was the quiet acceptance that God does not owe explanations to those he loves. He offers himself instead. The question, "Why me?" dissolved the moment he understood that pain is not evidence of divine neglect, but the place where divine purpose breathes. The cell did not lose its darkness. His eyes learned to see within it. That is the sacred reversal. The understanding that what you once begged to escape was actually where grace had been waiting all along. Suffering was not a punishment. It was participation in something eternal, a communion deeper than words could hold. He came to see that God's silence is not the end of the conversation. It is the beginning of transformation. Every believer prays to hear the voice of heaven, but few are willing to face what that voice sounds like when it stops speaking. Bonhoeffer learned that the absence of divine speech is not divine absence. It is an act of trust from God himself, a sign that he believes you are ready to walk by faith, not explanation. The silence that once mocked him had become holy ground. It was no longer a test to endure, but a revelation to inhabit. For in that silence, God was not hidden. He was embodied, suffering with him, transforming him through love that no longer needed to speak. And this is the paradox few ever reach. The moment you stop searching for answers is the moment the truth begins to live in you. Bonhoeffer's faith no longer asked, "Why me?" but whispered, "Use me." His suffering became seed. His silence became sermon. His captivity became cathedral. The bars that once confined his body had set his spirit free. He no longer looked for deliverance because he had already found it in surrender. That's the secret every soul resists. Freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of peace that no pain can steal. So when you ask, "Why me?" perhaps you are standing where Bonhoeffer once stood, at the threshold of revelation disguised as ruin. Maybe heaven's silence is not a void to fill, but a voice to hear differently. Maybe your unanswered prayers are not signs of rejection, but invitations to maturity. Bonhoeffer found the sacred answer not outside his suffering, but within it. The walls didn't speak, yet they revealed everything. God was not silent. He was speaking in a language too deep for words, faith, endurance, and love that outlives the darkness. And when you finally stop asking why, you might hear it too. When the final echo of Bonhoeffer's silence fades, something remains, a vibration in the soul that refuses to quiet. You begin to sense that his story was never about a man in a cell, but about every heart that has ever waited for God to speak and heard nothing but its own trembling breath. The bars were only symbols, mirrors for your own unseen prisons. The fears you cannot name, the prayers you no longer believe will be answered. Yet now, those same walls seem softer, less cruel, almost sacred. You understand that the silence you once called absence might have been presence all along, subtle, patient, waiting for you to listen differently. Bonhoeffer's darkness was never meant to be admired. It was meant to awaken your own hidden light. And if you listen closely, beneath the words, beneath the music, beneath even your thoughts, you might hear what he heard, a stillness that no longer feels empty. It hums with meaning. It tells you that faith is not a language of answers, but of endurance, that love is not the avoidance of suffering, but its transfiguration. You realize now that the silence of God is not a void to fear, but a threshold to cross. Everything you once begged to escape was only trying to teach you how to see. The pain, the waiting, the unanswered prayers, they were never punishments. They were rehearsals for surrender, training the heart to beat in time with eternity. And now you are no longer just watching his story. You are standing inside it. So when the world grows quiet again, remember this truth. Some answers are not meant to be spoken, only lived. The same silence that held Bonhoeffer now holds you. Let it shape you, not with noise, but with knowing. And if this story stirred something sacred within you, something you cannot yet name, do not let it fade into the scroll of forgetting. Leave a trace. share this message. Join the circle of those who have learned to trust the God who speaks through silence, because somewhere, in another soul's darkness, your echo might be the sound that leads them home.